Okay, this is chapter 5 of Zodiac. 5. Paul Lee Stein. Saturday, October 11th, 1969. It is not easy to park your car at the bottom of a steep San Francisco hill. The stocky man turned his wheels toward the curb, set his handbrake, locked the door, and puffed up the hill to catch a bus to the theater district. He got off at Post and Powell and stood for a while in Union Square watching the rows of canary-colored cabs coming and going from in front of the elegant old San Francisco hotel. This evening he wore a blue-black parka-type jacket to guard against the chill wind off the bay. Crossing Powell, he began walking up to Geary to Mason. Flurries of red taillights passed him, and he could see dark couples moving into the brilliant lights of the theater district a block away. It was 9:30, and the audience from the first show of Hair poured out of the Geary Theater. Next door to the Geary was the even more massive and ornate Curran. The stocky man moved back under the red-striped awning of Harold's Books and Magazines and watched the cabs, Luxor, DeSoto, Veterans, City, and Yellow, converge on the theaters. Paul Lee Stein was parked in the taxi zone in front of the St. Francis when he received a call for 9th Avenue. Stein pulled his cab into the Powell Street traffic and turned on to Geary. On the side of his cab were the words, "Call 626-2345, radio dispatched." The door on the driver's side had been caved in an accident days earlier. The crowd slowed Stein down. As he began to edge his cab ahead, passing the Pinecrest restaurant, a stocky man stepped from beneath a striped awning, placed his hand on the driver's side near the rearview mirror, and looked down into the cab. Lights behind the man's body silhouetted him, the glare showing through his crew-cut hair, revealing the curve of his skull. As he got in the back seat, the stranger requested an address in the Presidio Heights residential district. Stein logged the address on his trip sheet, Washington Street and Maple, and started the meter. The cab traveled west up Geary to the corner of Van Ness Avenue, where Stein turned right, then moved along Auto Row to California, where he took a left. 11 blocks later, Stein swung onto Divisadero. Another left, and the cab proceeded west on Washington. The night closed in behind them. Well lit and wet with fog, Washington Street was lined with stately, expensive homes, with great rows of steps and massive quantities of filigree and wrought iron. When the cab slowed at Maple and Washington, the trip sheet destination, the stocky man could dimly make out his own car parked at the foot of the steep hill. After he finished his work in the cab, the stocky man planned a sprint downhill to the auto and disappear into the night. Suddenly a man appeared in the headlights of Stein's cab, a man out walking his dog. The stocky man leaned forward and told the cab driver, "Go another block." There was a soft breeze, and the stocky man could hear wind chimes from one of the homes nearby. The cab stopped between two trees on the corner of Washington and Cherry, directly in front of 3898 Washington. Abruptly, the stocky stranger pressed the muzzle of a gun tightly against the driver's right cheek, just in front of his right ear. With the crook of his left arm, he seized Stein's throat. Vainly, Stein tried to raise his left hand over his right shoulder. The stocky man firmly squeezed the trigger, the firearm discharged. There was little noise. A seal was created between the skin and the muzzle, and the blast was expended into the body tissues. Particles of unburned powder exploded about the breech of the weapon, peppering the gloved hands of the attacker. A conical perforation of the skull was created as the projectile was fired. The bullet, twisting and spiraling, particles of molten metal being thrown off as it traveled over 1,000 feet per second, created multiple fractures of Stein's skull. The copper-jacketed lead bullet, mashed and fragmented into 4 segments, penetrated left and laterally toward the midsection of the left zygomatic arch, and finally lodged in the left temporalis muscle. In unison, the barrel and slide of the gun recoiled until the barrel's movement was arrested. Continuing backward, the slide passed over the hammer, cocked it, and slammed against the receiver as the empty casing was seized and ejected onto the floor of the cab. The slide sprung forward again, peeled off the next cartridge from the double-road magazine, and forced it into the chamber, then reloaded with the barrel. The gun was ready to be fired again. The killer exited the rear door and entered the right front door. Then he seized Stein's head in his lap while he took Stein's wallet and tore off a portion of his shirt. At 9:55 p.m., a 14-year-old girl directly across the street from the taxi looked out of the middle window from the second floor of the building. There was a party going on, but she leaned forward, shaded her eyes, and looked down into the misty street below. Abruptly, she called to her 16-year-old brother and a younger brother to come to the window. They were almost 50 feet away, and their view of the cab was unobstructed. A stocky man had the head of the cab driver cradled in his lap. He appeared to be struggling with the driver, searching him. Then he leaned over the cabbie's body to the driver's side and seemed to be wiping down the interior of the taxi. The stocky man had been doing something to the driver's body, but the partygoers, who had now crowded around the upstairs window, could not tell what. The front passenger side of the cab opened, and eventually the heavy-set man got out. He came around the cab, taking with him some sort of rag or towel, and began wiping down the driver's side door, the handle around the outside mirror, and the left passenger side. At one point, he opened up the driver's door and leaned forward to wipe off the area of the dashboard again. To steady himself, he leaned his right hand on the rail separating the front and rear windows. The fragment of cloth was still in his left hand. Then he closed the door and walked away. When he turned the corner, passing close to a mailbox, the children lost sight of him. He was headed north on Cherry in the direction of the Presidio. He did not run. While all this was happening, the partygoers had called the police communication center. The report was logged by the operator at 9:58 p.m. The operator could tell the caller was under great stress. As he filled out the card with the caller's address, he asked, "Was the crime in progress?" "Yes." He tried to get a physical description of the man, and at this point an incredible blunder was made. Somehow the assailant was mistakenly described as an NMA, Negro male adult, a black man. What was the general direction of his departure? Was he armed? The operator jotted down the answers. Immediately the card was handed to the dispatcher, who leaned forward over his lightened panel, consulted a complex map of San Francisco divided into districts and centers, and broadcast a general call to all police units, cars, and wagons, an APB. "Caution urged," he added. A police patrol unit was near Cherry and Washington and raced towards the scene. The patrol reached Jackson and Cherry by 10 and saw a stocky man lumbering along in the fog toward the Presidio. The radio unit's patrolman Donald Fuke and Eric Zelms, looking for a black man, shouted to the stranger and asked if he had seen anything unusual in the last minute or so. The stocky man called out he'd seen a man waving a gun running east on Washington, and the patrol car sped off in that direction. Had the radio unit actually stopped the stocky man, they would have seen that he was drenched in blood where Stein's head had rested in his lap. The stains were hidden by his dark clothes and the deep shadows of the trees along the street. The officers, because of the communications mix-up, had no reason to be looking for a WMA, a white male adult. Had the policeman called the stocky man to the side of their car for a few quick questions, both officers might well have been gunned down. The killer would have had the advantage of the 9mm gun hidden in his right hand. The senior patrolman had seen the stocky man's left profile clearly, but it would be some time before the two cops realized they had actually spoken with Stein's killer. They had come within a whisper of capturing him. This was the beginning of the stocky man's pathological obsession with the San Francisco police. The stocky man stopped in the cool night air. Instead of doubling back to his car right away, he went on into the Presidio and walked to the Julius Kahn playground. Then, crouching slightly against the stone wall, the man worked south back to his auto. At 10:55 p.m., Officers Armand Pelisti and Frank Pita arrived, responding to the alarm simultaneously with Homicide Inspector Walter Crack, who was nearby on his way home. Both cars stopped just behind the cab. The men ran from their autos to find Paul Stein shot in the head, his upper torso in the passenger side, his head resting on the floorboard. When Crack opened the door, the driver's left hand fell outward, palm up, nearly touching the street. The attacker had not bothered to take his watch, and the detective could see the thin black band around the slain man's wrist, a Timex. The attacker had also left Stein his class ring. The cab meter was still running. The keys to the cab were missing. The officers called an ambulance, code 3, and broadcast an amending description of the killer as a white male adult that the teenagers had given them. More units converged on the scene. Ambulance number 82 arrived at 10:10 p.m. The ambulance steward pronounced Stein dead. Crack had called out every dog unit available and requested a fire department spotlight vehicle to light up the area. He then notified the San Francisco coroner. Because Inspector Crack had heard the initial police radio communication and automatically responded, with the help of the 2 Richmond station cops, he was able to preserve a perfect crime scene. At 10:20 p.m., a call was placed for the on-duty homicide team, the men who would stay on the case until it was solved. Homicide Inspector Dave Tashi was exhausted, physically and mentally. He had gone to bed the minute he had gotten home at 8 o'clock. The phone rang at 10:30 p.m. Tashi answered and heard the voice of the night office police operator calling from the 4th floor of the Hall of Justice on Bryant Street. Dave, the operator said, yellow cab driver's been shot, probably robbed, and possibly stabbed. Where? Groaned Tashi. On Washington Street, said the communications officer, between Maple and Cherry, closer to Cherry. What the hell is going on? Thought Tashi. This would be his 4th murder since the 7th of October. He'd just gotten home from a homicide, a beating death. Jesus Christ, 4 homicides in 4 days. The detective reached for his familiar yellow-lined tablet and wrote the date, the exact time he had received the information by phone, and the name of the communications operator. Tashi phoned his partner, Bill Armstrong, and told him that he'd pick him up in 10 minutes. Then Tashi had an afterthought. He dialed the number of the operations center. There are a lot of people on a Saturday night wandering by that scene. Be sure they try and preserve the scene as much as possible. Tell them to keep as many people as they can away from the cab, and under no conditions let anybody touch the vehicle. Tashi called the crime lab, stumbled into his bathroom, and ran his hands through his curly black hair. The detective brushed his teeth and dressed quickly in tan slacks, his second string of soft hush puppies, dark socks, corduroy jacket, and all-weather raincoat. It was cold out, and he was often gone for as long as 2 days. Inspectors work in 8 two-man rotating teams. The on-call team is responsible for all homicides occurring during their week and have the next 7 weeks to work on these cases. Tashi paused long enough to gulp down a lukewarm cup of instant Folgers coffee, grabbed his ever-present folder, and kissed his wife Carol goodbye. She was used to his being called away at any time and on a moment's notice. He started up the family car, a red 2-door Borgward, and backed out of the garage. Minutes later, Tashi spotted his partner on the corner wearing a black turtleneck sweater and black raincoat. Armstrong got in. On the way to the crime scene, Tashi notified the military police for help in the search of the killer. The 2 inspectors arrived at the buzzing murder site at 11:10, precisely the same time as the MPs, and just 3 minutes after the coroner had gotten there. Red lights, flashing blue lights, Kelg lights, blazing yellow lights. Washington Street was glowing like a summer's day. Several hundred people had gathered by the time the detectives parked across from the cab, just under the window where the teenagers' party had been going on. Tashi was glad he had called the operations to be sure the cab was really sealed off. But even while isolating the scene from an over-curious crowd, Tashi and Armstrong had to be careful not to drive away any important witnesses or touch or step on anything themselves. A patrolman filled them in on the details of the murder. It seemed to Armstrong and Tashi that this had begun as one of the many cab robberies that occurred in San Francisco every week, but had become a clumsy and inefficient cab robbery gone terribly wrong. The two partners considered it the work of an amateur. The killer left the scene dripping in blood and most likely did not get much money in his effort. They could estimate from the way bill that Stein had on him at most $20 or $25. The killer had taken Stein's wallet. In his yellow ledger, Tashi wrote a complete description of the body and its immediate surroundings. On Stein's person, the killer had overlooked 7 keys, 1 ring, 1 checkbook, and some papers, auto and motorcycle registrations. There was exactly $4.12 in the dead man's pocket, all in change. There was blood all over the cab. Tashi stayed with the car while Armstrong took the names and addresses of all witnesses. Tashi leaned down and scrutinized the body, noting any tears in the clothing, whether the blood was fresh or dry, or if there were any weapons in sight. Blood still glistened on the car seat and dashboard, even the cab meter. It clung and hid in every crevice and crack of the driver's side. Stein bled profusely, wrote Tashi. Meanwhile, Armstrong had the uniformed officers checking and rechecking to see if any of the residents had seen or heard anything. Even when the 2 inspectors were not together, they knew what the other was doing. They avoid overlapping. Usually, one man will opt to stay with the body, as did Tashi this night. Tashi had a firm belief that it is the body that will tell you almost all you need to know to solve a case. Freehand, on a blank sheet of paper, the detective made a sketch of the scene, noting the taxi and buildings and the relationship of the body to them. Even photographs taken from every conceivable angle give a distorted view of the body in respect to its surroundings, so he made exact measurements with his steel tape and added these to the sketch. When the coroner's office steward pulled the body out of the cab, Stein's bloodied San Francisco street guide came with him and fell into the street. The body was placed in a dark green-black plastic body bag with a long zipper and then carried to a stretcher. Photographs were taken of anything that may have been underneath Stein. Tashi bent forward. Yes, there it was. Almost under the seat and toward the center post of the cab gleamed the copper color of one 9mm casing. On the corner of the front passenger seat were 3 streaks that might have been the marks of 3 fingers printed in blood. Since Stein had fallen to the passenger side, palms up, Tashi thought they might belong to the killer. Just under the dash, Tashi found a pair of dull black leather gloves. They were soaked with blood, but were too small for a man. Later, he discovered that they belonged to a woman passenger from earlier in the day. At 11:30, the crime lab responded. Bob DeGozzi from San Rafael and Bill Kirkendall from Pacifica. These were 2 of the department's best lab men. Both were fingerprint experts. DeGozzi and Kirkendall searched the interior of Stein's cab for any latent prints the killer might have left behind. Latent prints are those which are transferred to surfaces by the natural oils of the hair and face that palms and fingers may have touched. The perspiration from the hands is not lubricative enough to leave impressions. Unless a person has handled grease or dirt, these prints are invisible and must be developed by dusting the surface of a gray or black powder. Once a print is visible, it can be lifted by transparent tape and applied to a 3x5-inch card with a contrasting background. The men marked the placement of latent prints, measured the distance of the impressions from the floor and roof, and had the areas photographed by men from the photo lab. Later, prints of all the people who may have ridden in the cab that day, located through the taxi trip sheet, would have to be taken and compared to any clear prints the lab could come up with. The large majority of the prints would be fragmentary and superimposed. Fingerprints of Stein would have to be taken. Most likely they would already be on file at Yellow Cab. A detailed inspection of the hands of the victim would also be made for any cuts, bruises, or torn fingernails, as well as an examination of the victim's hair. Tashi had noticed 2 long, dark marks on Stein's left hand. Perhaps he had thrown up his hand to protect himself from the gun blast. Then, the 2 lab men discovered the most important clue in the Stein case, the prints of a right hand. The prints had been made in blood. This information and where the prints were found was to be kept totally confidential. The coroner authorized removal of the victims to the morgue and deputies Schultz and Kindred took charge of the body. Armstrong and Tachi had gotten a rather vague description of the killer from the teenage witnesses, and now they widened the search. "Canvass the area," said Tachi, "and look for anyone who matches this description. Dark jacket, crew-cut hair, big guy, kinda stocky, husky." Dog units began to check the surrounding blocks for anyone hiding in doorways, driveways, or the shadows. Tashi and Armstrong had made a painstaking search for more shells or bullet holes and found none. The cartridge was labeled and identified with extreme care so that it would not be mutilated in any way. Any recovered spent slug is marked with the officer's special mark on the nose, never on the side, so that the striations on the bullet are not disturbed. Custody of exhibits of evidence are traced by the time of recovery so that a chain of legal evidence can be maintained. The crime lab would need the fatal bullet, fatal shell, any clothing of the victim containing powder burns, and if possible, the lethal weapon itself. The Presidio, the present home of the 6th Army, lies a block and 1/2 north of Cherry in Washington. The base is open around the clock with virtually no security and with very few restricted sections. The detectives heard from neighbors that a stocky figure was seen dashing across Julius Kahn public playground and into the dense undergrowth of the Presidio. Tashi had the high-powered floodlights from the fire department moved into place to illuminate the entire area. A large number of patrolmen began to search tree by tree, shrub by shrub, flashlights slashing lines into the night. In the distance, voices called to each other. Somewhere ahead, they hoped their quarry was also pushing his way through the scrub, trying to lose himself in the green expanse of the Presidio. Somewhere ahead, hiding in the darkness and silence, they hoped to find the killer of Paul Stine. The Dog Patrol Unit, 7 of the best search dogs in the country, gathered at the front entrance of the Presidio and were deployed one at a time in various directions. For more than an hour, the dogs moved with swift determination, sniffing the thick undergrowth inside the walls. Armstrong and Tashi considered the possibilities. Had the killer gone quickly through the dark woods, emerged from the Presidio at Richardson Avenue, taken Highway 101 past Fort Point onto the Golden Gate Bridge, and vanished into Marion County? Could he have cut across Julius Kahn Playground and doubled back southward to Jackson Street? A call to Stine's boss at Yellow Cab, Leroy Street, revealed that the driver's last dispatch was 9:45 p.m. to 509th Avenue. When Stine did not show up, the fare was assigned another cab. The meter of Stine's cab, still running when he was found, read at exactly 10:46 p.m. $6.25. This indicated Stine had picked up another fare, the killer, en route to the 9th Avenue assignment. Backtracking through the meter reading, Tashi could determine roughly where the killer had flagged Stine down. The city's cabs in 1969 were among the most expensive in the United States. For a 2-mile trip, Stine would have charged $1.35. How had the slayer gotten to the theater district in the first place, and had he gone back to get his car? Was it now parked in the large downtown center parking and garage, wondered Tashi. At 1 a.m., the cab was towed across town to the Hall of Justice, followed by Degotsi and Kirkendall. At 2 a.m., the search was called off. Armstrong and Tashi quit the scene. A killer had stalked the streets for this rich and elegant neighborhood, and then vanished into the fog. Sunday, October 12, 1969. The police description of the killer was broadcasted continuously throughout the night and early morning. By that time, the MPs had ceased their search of the Presidio. At 1:30 a.m., 10 minutes after Stine's wife, Claudia, had been notified by phone of his death, Degotsi and Kirkendall began their search of the cab at the Hall of Justice impound room. Yellow cab number 912, California license Y17413, was gone over thoroughly for more casings, slugs, bullet holes, or any other evidence. Stine's body was the first to be autopsied that morning at a little after 9:30 a.m. The coroner's autopsy room, milky white and cold, is just behind the Hall of Justice and 3 floors under Takashi's office. The bodies in the storage room are kept on sloping metal tables and drawers, each with its own bus terminal locker-like number. The 38 degrees Fahrenheit stainless steel refrigerated alcove is next to the autopsy room, which is kept at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Bleak fluorescent lighting cools and burns out every shadow. The pathologists dress in green surgical gowns and wear heavy household rubber gloves, the cuffs turned up. Usually, the chief medical examiner observes or performs the autopsy himself. An autopsy report will contain, at the very least, the age, sex, race, frame, and distinguishing characteristics of the victim. Signs of death such as rigor mortis, heat loss, lividity, and decomposition are registered. An external examination of head and trunk and internal scrutiny of the organ system, stomach contents, neck, spinal cord, head, major vessels, and heart is made. A red manila tag with wire looped through one end is twisted around the right big toe of the cadaver. Before the blood and grime are removed, close-up photos are made of the dead body fully clothed under the guidance of the pathologist. Any material from the wound is saved for power granule test. In order to run out every possible contributing cause of death, an entire autopsy is done even if the body cavity is not penetrated. Penetrating is a term used to indicate an object entering the body but not exiting. When the body is both entered and exited, it is called perforating. The autopsy surgeon examined the wound in Stein's head. It was a jagged, star-shaped tear. Gunpowder and soot had created a pocket behind the skin and the skull, which had been blackened by the tremendous heat. Charring converged from the outside of the wound towards its center. The tattooing embedded powder particles in the skin adjacent to the ragged wound had been caused by the flare and expanding gases. Both the smudging on Stein's temple and the large singed wound indicated to the surgeon that the muzzle of the gun had been held in close contact. In such a shooting, the wound of exit is much smaller than the wound of entrance, unlike a non-contact wound in which the reverse is true. In the cab driver's case, the bullet did not exit, but lodged. Post-mortem lividity, a purplish discoloration of the parts of the body nearest the floor, occurs about 2 hours after death. This gives an indication of how much time has passed since death occurred. The muscles around Stein's head, neck, jaw, and eyelids had begun to stiffen, the beginning of rigor mortis. It would be 2 to 3 days before the rigidity would start to disappear. While the autopsy was being performed, the police questioned the teenage witnesses and prepared a composite sketch with a policeman who doubled as an artist. He laid out his ebony pencil eraser stick and 16-pound Strathmore layout bond. Tom Mauricis, the best police artist in the state, once told me, "You've got to tell the witness to leave in himself and the infinite capacity of the mind to retain details. You conduct a guided interview. You get a feel of the person, their mental range, their free-floating imagery. My God. Like Maurice, this artist worked from feeling and intuition. Also, like most composite artists, he kept a library of pictures, people with different shaped faces and hairstyles. The witnesses look through the photos until they find one similar to the suspect. This gives the artist a foundation on which to build. The police artist was doing his drawing full face because that is the way that mug shots are taken, and the composite thus can be more easily compared to them. Homicide descriptions are usually the most difficult. The observer's attention is most likely on the weapon. He had a stocky build, the teenagers agreed. Looked like he was about 5 foot 8 inches tall. He was wearing a dark navy blue or black parka-type jacket and dark trousers. What was the shape of the man's head? Asked the artist. Triangular, round, square. Is it like any of these? After a half hour, the artist showed the uncompleted sketch to the teenagers and allowed them to look over his shoulder while he was working, letting them help correct and define. How about the forehead, the eyes, the nose, large ears, color of hair, long or short hair? Did you notice if the man had any scars? Is the nose anything like the one I've drawn? Is this close? Okay, is there anything I should change? Did I make the eyes far enough apart? Have I made him old enough? The teenagers had described a white male with reddish or blonde crew-cut hair, around 25 or 30 years of age, wearing glasses. Armstrong and Takashi decided to circulate the resulting composite drawing, bulletin number 87-69. They sent one to each cab company in the city. The detectives wanted to alert the taxi drivers that a pattern of cab driver killings might be developing. Each company got 100 copies of a wanted circular that described the killer's method of operation. Suspect takes cab in downtown area at 9:30 p.m. and sits in front seat with driver. Tells driver destination is Washington and Laurel area or area near Park or Presidio. Upon reaching destination, suspect orders driver to continue on at gunpoint into or near Park, where he then perpetrates robbery. In one case, victim was shot in head at contact. The weapon was a 9mm automatic. Armstrong and Tashi wanted any driver who saw anyone resembling the sketch to get in touch with them. Unknown to both detectives, they did have other witnesses, the 2 policemen in the radio car who had actually spoken to the killer and been directed on a wild goose chase. At this time, colorful and soft-spoken, Dave Tashi was probably the most dynamic member of the police department's elite corps, the homicide inspectors, who was the city's super cop. A flamboyant dresser, the stylish detective could be found at work in a short-sleeve silk shirt, corduroy jacket, dark brown ankle boots with large brass buckles, and his ever-present large bow tie. Tashi's shoulder holster, a unique upside-down quick-draw model, is worn on his left, with a vertical refill row of 7 cartridges and a pair of handcuffs. The gun is a .38 caliber Cobra, one of the 6 variations of the solid frame .38 Special with a swing-out cylinder and is made of aluminum alloy. It's a double single-action revolver weighing just over a pound and measuring 7 inches in overall length. Steve McQueen met with Tashi before the filming of his 1968 movie Bullet, which was set in San Francisco. McQueen had a duplicate of Tashi's special holster and gun made up and based much of the character on the Italian Marina-born sleuth. Tashi was a compact, muscular man with dark eyes, strong, bow-shaped mouth, and cleft chin, all dominated by abundant curly black hair. Over the years, he had tried not to bring his case problems home with him, but when the solutions remained elusive and haunted him, he would drive the length of the Great Highway or take midnight strolls through his Sunset District neighborhood. And sometimes, after a particularly tough day, Tashi would come home to Carol and his 3 preteen daughters and lounge in his big brown leather easy chair, put a big band record on the stereo, usually Artie Shaw's greatest hits, and sip a Manhattan while singing along as he'd done at Galileo High and when he was at a California street bartender. He had even considered music as a career. He became a cop instead. Tashi's senior partner was Bill Armstrong, tall and handsome, reminiscent of Paul Drake on the old Perry Mansion television show. The 40-year-old Armstrong had sharp features and a strong jaw, his face framed with a curly brush of silver hair and the glasses he sometimes wears. His tasteful business suits and short hair are a contrast to the darker, slimmer Tashi. Armstrong was also the father of 3 girls and tried not to bring his caseload home with him. Lately, this had been pretty hard to achieve. Stein's blood-stained clothing had been removed, an identification tag wire put on each article and placed under a drying lamp. When his clothes had dried completely, they were laid flat with butcher paper between each article to avoid the possibility of any sort of transfer. The clothing was listed on a clothing slip and turned into the property clerk's office to be safeguarded for future lab tests. No piece of apparel is disposed of until the case is terminated. All articles in the pockets are catalogued. The body is placed on the autopsy table and the surgeon dictates as he examines. The upper half of the sloped metal table on which the body rests has a grated surface. At the foot is a shallow, sloping tub that runs beneath the grating. Through the tub streams a continuous flow of water. The arms of the body are at the sides. A wooden block under the shoulder blades thrusts the chest upward and causes the head to fall back. Suspended from the ceiling is a microphone that records every step as dictated by the pathologist, including an accurate description and location of all wounds. The necropsy surgeon dictated to the coroner, John Lee. The body is that of a well-developed, well-nourished young adult white male appearing about the stated age. The head is symmetrical and covered with a sparse quantity of dark hair receding at the temples. There is a large, ragged, irregular-shaped apparent gunshot entry wound over the right side of the head. This wound is located at the superior and anterior attachment of the right ear. The vertical dimensions measure 4 centimeters and transverse dimensions measure 2 centimeters. There is a blackening on the skin over the ventral aspect of this wound, extending for a distance of 2 centimeters. When probed, the wound penetrates left laterally toward the mid-portion of the left zygomatic arch. There is a large quantity of blood present over the face. The murdered man's wounds was removed and examined microscopically for powder residue. The pathologist made notes on pre-printed schematic drawings of a male body, shown front and back with the head shown from above. In an autopsy, a Y-shaped incision is made in the chest and abdomen. A triangular portion of the rib cage is removed. When the throat and neck have been examined, the autopsy surgeon removes the heart and lungs, ligating the large blood vessels. The kidneys, pancreas, liver, spleen, and internal tract are taken from the abdominal cavity after the heart has been examined and dissected on a black dissection board. A sample of blood is taken and blood type is established. Finally, the pelvic contents and genitals are reviewed. The cerebellum is fixed by an injection of formaldehyde, and the pathologist opens the skull with an electric circular saw, carefully avoiding penetration of the brain. The top is pried off, cranial membrane still clinging. Before the brain is scooped out intact and weighed on a white metal scale, the interior surface of the top of the skull and brain is studied. The brain is then segmented to see if any abnormalities are present. Then it is up to the attendant to reassemble the form by placing viscera and organs and putting back in place the triangular piece of rib cage. He stitches up the Y-shaped incision, working from the pubis to mid-chest. The body is then washed with water and sponged, covered with a black rubber sheet, and returned to its mortuary compartment. Whenever a physician has to extract a bullet from a body, he must use caution, since the impressions of the gun barrel on the bullets link it to the weapon from which it was fired. In most cases, the surgeon scratches his identifying mark on the bullet's nose. In Stein's instance, a smashed and fragmented copper-jacketed lead bullet was removed. The 4 fragments of metal were placed in a glassine envelope, which was then sealed and signed by the pathologist. The sealed flap of the envelope also indicated the location of the found bullet. Diagnostics: gunshot wound of skin and subcutaneous tissue, wound of head. Cause of death: gunshot wound of the brain. Stein's cab, impounded in a double-locked room, would be gone over by lab technicians for another 2 days. The only blood found in the cab was type ORH negative, Stein's blood type. Stein would have been 30 in 69 days. He had been attending San Francisco State College and working the night shift for Yellow Cab to pay for his education. He even sold insurance. In January, he had planned to complete his postgraduate work for a doctorate in English. He had worked as a reporter for his high school paper and later for the Turlock Journal. A powerful man with a solid 180 pounds spread over a 5-foot 9-inch frame, Stein had lived with his wife in an old green Victorian house divided into multiple apartments at 1842 Fell Street, across from the long verdant panhandle leading into Golden Gate Park. The couple had no children. Approximately 5 weeks earlier, Stein had been held up by 2 gunmen. 12 days before his murder, on a Tuesday night, another yellow cab driver was held up. Could this have been a dry run for the actual killing? Monday, October 13th, 1969. At 9 a.m., Stein's file prints were sent over to homicide and compared to the visible prints found in the cab. The bloody prints were not Stein's. Fingerprints are divided into general types: plain arches, tented arches, plain loops, plain whorls, central pocket loop whorls, radial whorls, double loop whorls, accidental whorls. The fine lines on the fingerprints are called ridges, and the spaces between are known as furrows. The average print has about 50 ridge characteristics. The design formed by the ridges is called patterns. Partial prints often contain 12 characteristic points, but in the case of fragmentary prints, they most often cannot be positively matched. Anything less than 12 points of similarity would be subject to an expert's opinion. Tashi and Armstrong, using the cab trip sheet, went back to the addresses where the passengers were left off, knocked on a lot of doors, and located about a third of the people who had ridden in that particular cab on Saturday. Later on in the day, a member of the crime lab would come out to roll a set of their prints to eliminate them positively as murder suspects. In the crime lab, print man Bob Digas classified the visible prints found in the cab. When the killer had leaned forward to wipe the driver's dashboard area, he had held onto the beam separating the front and rear windows and left prints from his right hand. Middle finger and third finger of right hand, Digas wrote. 8 points on 2 fingers, in blood.